My name is Harold. I am 63 years old. I have two hands that have worked construction sites for over 30 years. I have a back that aches every winter morning. I have a heart that has loved deeply, quietly, and without condition my entire life. And on Christmas Eve, the most sacred night of the year in my home, I walked into my own kitchen, poured myself a cup of coffee, and found a folded piece of paper sitting on the table next to the salt shaker. Just a piece of paper. No ribbon, no bow, no card, just a note. I picked it up, and I read it. Harold, me and Cody are going to Florida for the holidays. Don't wait up, and by the time we get back, we'd appreciate it if you moved your things out of the house. It's time for a change. No love, no name signed at the bottom, just those two sentences. Just those cold, empty words sitting on my kitchen table on Christmas Eve, while the tree lights blinked in the living room, and a pot of coffee gurgled on the counter like nothing in the world was wrong. I stood there for a very long time. I didn't cry. I didn't yell. I didn't slam the note down on the table. I just folded it back along the same crease it came with, slid it into the pocket of my flannel shirt, and picked up my phone. And I made one call, stay with me, because what happened when they came back changed everything. Let me tell you about myself, because I think it matters. I grew up in a small town in rural Tennessee. My father was a carpenter. My mother cleaned houses for people who had more than we did, and she did it with a smile every single day. We didn't have much, but we had something that I've come to understand is rarer than money. We had dignity. We had respect. We had love that showed up every day, not just on good days. I started working at 16. By 22, I had my contractor's license. By 30, I had built enough of a reputation that I was managing crews across 3 counties. I wasn't a rich man, but I was a good one. I married my wife Diane when I was 26 years old. She was 24. She was beautiful in a quiet way, the kind of beautiful that sneaks up on you. She had dark hair and a laugh that came from somewhere deep in her chest, and she made the best chicken and dumplings I had ever tasted in my life. We had one son together, Daniel, born when I was 28. Daniel was my world. I want you to understand that. Daniel was my absolute world. I coached his little league team. I drove him to school every morning for 12 years, even when the job site was in the opposite direction. I stayed up late helping him with math homework that I barely understood myself. I worked double shifts for 6 months straight to pay for his college tuition, so he wouldn't start his life buried in debt. And when Daniel met a woman named Stacy during his junior year of college, I welcomed her with open arms. Stacy was different from us. She came from money. Her father was some kind of financial consultant in Atlanta. Her mother did interior design. They had a summer home. They drove new cars every 2 years. And they looked at people like me, working class people hands, dirty people with a particular kind of smile that isn't really a smile at all. You know the one I mean, the smile that says, "How charming that you exist." But Daniel loved her, so I loved her too. They got married when Daniel was 27, a big wedding, fancy venue. Diane and I contributed every penny we could, $12,000, that I had been saving in a separate account for 3 years, quietly, without telling anyone. I handed Daniel a check the week before the wedding, and I told him, "This is for you and your future, son. Build something good." He hugged me and cried a little. That was the last time I remembered Daniel being fully himself around me. After the wedding, things changed. Slowly at first, then all at once, the way most things fall apart. Stacy's son, Cody, came from a previous relationship. He was 8 years old when Stacy and Daniel married. And I want to be careful about how I say this, because I am not a man who blames children for the behavior of adults. Cody was not a bad kid. But Cody was raised in a household where things were handed over rather than earned, and where adults in his life confused giving things with giving love. He was 11 by the time the problems really started. He'd come to our house, the house that Diane and I had owned for 22 years, and he would open the refrigerator without asking, put his feet on the coffee table, change the television channel while I was mid-sentence, and once, he knocked over a framed photograph of my mother, God rest her soul, reaching across the shelf for a video game controller. And he didn't even look down at the broken glass. I picked it up. I said nothing. I said nothing because Daniel was in the room, and Daniel said nothing, and I had learned by then that saying something would only lead to Stacy pulling Daniel into the kitchen and the two of them coming back out 5 minutes later with identical tight expressions, and then Daniel would look at me with apologetic eyes but a closed mouth, and Stacy would say something like, "Harold, Cody's just a kid. He doesn't mean anything by it," and I would nod and say, "Of course," and swallow it, because that is what I do. That is who I am. I swallow things. I keep the peace. My father taught me that a real man controls his reaction. A real man doesn't escalate. A real man waits. Patience, Harold. My father used to say, God don't move fast, but he always moves right. So I waited. But the thing about swallowing things, eventually, the stomach gets full. Now let me tell you about how Diane and I ended up in this situation to begin with. Because here's what you need to understand. It was my house, 22 years. Mortgage paid off 8 years early because I worked every overtime hour that ever existed. That house, 3 bedrooms, a screened porch, a garden out back where my wife grew tomatoes every summer, that house was mine. Bought and paid for. 18 months before Christmas Eve, Daniel called me. "Dad," he said, "I need to ask you something big." I told him to go ahead. Stacy and I are going through a rough patch financially. Her design business hit a wall and my company restructured. We're behind on rent. We need a place to land for a little while, just until we get back on our feet. I didn't ask questions. I didn't negotiate terms. I didn't say, "Let me think about it." I said, "Come home, son." 3 days later, a moving truck pulled up to my house. My son, his wife, and her boy moved into the guest bedroom and the converted office. And I remember standing in the driveway, watching that truck unload, and feeling something warm in my chest. Like purpose, like I was being a father. What I didn't know, what I couldn't have known standing in that driveway, was that something had already been decided. Something I would not find out until Christmas Eve, but I'm getting ahead of myself. For the first few months, things were manageable. Diane cooked, I worked. Daniel went to his new job. Stacy started picking up design clients again. Cody went to school. It felt, sometimes, like a real family, but underneath the surface, there were cracks, and the cracks grew. Stacy began making comments about the house, small ones at first. "Harold, this kitchen layout is really inefficient, isn't it? Or don't you think this living room would look better with different furniture?" I always said something kind. "Maybe so, Stacy. Feel free to rearrange if you like." That was my first mistake, because she did rearrange. She moved my wife's china cabinet. She replaced the curtains my mother had sewn by hand with some things from a catalog. She put a sign in the front hallway that said "Live, Laugh, Love" in big block letters, right over the spot where my father's military photo used to hang. I moved the photo to the bedroom. I said nothing. Then the finances shifted. Daniel and Stacy stopped talking about moving out. The conversations became about settling in. Stacy ordered a new couch for the living room, charged it to a credit card, didn't ask me, and when it arrived, 2 delivery men carried out the old couch, the one Diane and I had bought together in 1999, and left it on the curb. I found it there when I came home from work. I stood in front of my old couch on the curb for a long moment. Then I went inside, and I said, very quietly, "Stacy, that was our couch." She turned from the kitchen counter and said, "Harold, it was 20 years old. The springs were shot. This new one is so much better, you'll see." And Daniel was there. He looked at the couch. He looked at me. And he said nothing. That was the night something in me began to quietly shift. I did not say a word, but inside, something changed. My wife Diane, and here I have to stop and tell you something that breaks my heart even as I say it. My wife Diane had been diagnosed with early-stage Alzheimer's the previous spring. It was a quiet diagnosis. She'd been forgetting small things for a year, names, appointments, where she put her reading glasses. And then one afternoon she called me at the job site and asked me to come home because she couldn't remember how to get back from the grocery store that she had been going to for 17 years. I came home, we went to the doctor, we heard the word, and I made a decision that night, lying in the dark next to my wife while she slept. I decided that whatever time we had left where she was still her, still present, still able to smile and recognize my face and hold my hand, that time was going to be peaceful. That time was going to be full of love. I never told Daniel about his mother's diagnosis. I know some of you are thinking, why not? How could you not tell your son? Because I know my son, and I know what that information would do. It would become leverage, not because Daniel is a bad man, but because Stacy was in his ear. And with Stacy in his ear, everything became a transaction. I was protecting Diane. December arrived and Diane was having a good stretch, clear days mostly. She recognized everyone, remembered conversations, laughed at the old inside jokes we'd had for decades. I was grateful. I put up the Christmas tree the first weekend of December, just like always. I strung the lights on the porch. I put the wreath on the door. Stacy said the wreath was tacky. I bought a nicer wreath, put it up, said nothing. Daniel had been distant all month. Working late, he said. I noticed he and Stacy whispered a lot. Stopped when I walked into rooms. Had long phone calls out on the back porch that ended when they heard the sliding door. I noticed. I said nothing. The week before Christmas, I overheard something. I was in the hallway, coming from the bathroom in the middle of the night. Their bedroom door was cracked, and I heard Stacy's voice, low and certain. "Daniel, this is our shot. The market timing is perfect. We can flip it for nearly double. We just need him out of the way first." And I heard Daniel's voice, my son's voice, quieter, uncertain. "I don't know, Stacy. It's his house." And then Stacy again. "It won't be for long." I stood in that hallway in my socks and my old pajamas, and I felt something cold move through me. Not panic, not rage, just clarity. Suddenly everything made sense. The couch, the curtains, the live laugh love sign, the questions Stacy had been asking about the property value, the appraiser who had just happened to be in the neighborhood. 2 months back, a man Stacy had introduced as a friend of her father's who wanted to see the place. They were planning to take my house, my pay, off 22-year house. I went back to bed. I lay next to Diane. She was sleeping peacefully. I listened to her breathe, and I thought, and I planned. Christmas Eve arrived cold and clear. Diane was having a slower day, a little foggy, a little distant. I made her oatmeal and sat with her at the kitchen table while she looked out the window at the frost on the garden. We held hands. She smiled at me with that quiet smile of hers. "Harold," she said, "I feel like something's happening. It's Christmas, Diane." I told her. "Good things are happening." She nodded like she believed me. I squeezed her hand. An hour later, I heard the front door. A suitcase rolling across the hardwood floor. Voices, Stacy's, Cody's. The sound of a car engine starting in the driveway. And then silence. I walked into the kitchen. There was the note. "Harold, me and Cody are going to Florida for the holidays. Don't wait up. And by the time we get back, we'd appreciate it if you moved your things out of the house. It's time for a change." I read it twice. I looked around my kitchen, my grandmother's clock ticking on the wall, my wife's handwriting on the recipe card tucked beside the stove, my father's coffee mug, the one with the faded American flag, sitting in the dish rack, my house. And then a strange thing happened. I smiled, not a mean smile, not a hard smile, just a quiet smile. The smile of a man who has been waiting for confirmation and has finally received it. I folded the note along its crease, slid it into my pocket, picked up my phone, and made one call. I am not going to tell you who I called just yet. I'll tell you this, the call lasted 11 minutes, and by the end of it, the person on the other end of the line said, "Harold, are you sure? Because once we do this, it's done." And I said, "I've been sure for a long time. I just needed them to show me who they really were." "Merry Christmas, Harold." The person said, "Merry Christmas," I said back. And then I went back to the living room, turned on the Christmas tree lights, put on the old Johnny Cash Christmas album that Diane and I had been listening to for 20 years, and I sat with my wife and held her hand, and we watched the lights blink on and off in the pine branches. And for the first time in 18 months, I felt completely at peace. Now, let me tell you about the twist. 3 things that Daniel and Stacy did not know. The first thing, 6 months before they moved in, long before Daniel called asking for help, I had already met with my attorney, a man named Gerald Pittman, who had been my lawyer for 19 years. And in that meeting, I had set up a living trust for the house and all my assets. The house was transferred into that trust. My name remained the trustee. Diane was co-trustee. The eventual beneficiaries were 2 organizations, a veterans housing nonprofit I'd been donating to for years, and a small scholarship fund at the local community college, established in my mother's name. The house could not be sold without my signature, and my signature alone. It could not be taken. It could not be leveraged. It was protected. Stacy's plan, whatever it was, had already been made impossible before it began. The second thing, I mentioned that I worked in construction. What I did not tell you is that 3 years before all of this, I had sold a portion of my contracting business to a larger firm. It was not a dramatic sale. I didn't announce it. I just did what made sense. And the number on that check was significant enough that the money has been sitting in accounts that neither Daniel nor Stacy had any knowledge of. I am not a wealthy man in the way wealthy people think of themselves, but I am a man without debt, without need, and without desperation, which means, unlike what they imagined, I had no vulnerability. They thought they were pushing out a tired old man with nowhere to go. They had no idea who they were dealing with. And the third thing, the thing that mattered most, Daniel didn't know about his mother's diagnosis, but someone else did. Someone I had called 6 months earlier, when I first started noticing the whispers and the appraiser and the calculating way Stacy looked at the square footage of my living room. I had called Daniel's uncle my brother-in-law, Earl, Diane's brother, a man who loved his sister like oxygen and who had always, privately, harbored deep reservations about Stacy. I had told Earl everything, and I had asked Earl to do something very specific. I asked him to find out what was actually being planned. Earl has friends in real estate. It didn't take him long. What he found out made my stomach drop, but it did not surprise me. Stacy had already been in contact with a real estate attorney. She had already run a title search on the property. She had already gotten an informal appraisal. The friend who visited was not a friend of her father's. He was a buyer's agent. She had already identified a potential buyer and had, according to Earl's source, told that buyer that the property would be available by the first of the year. She was planning to claim rights to the house through my son. She knew about my wife's condition. Somehow she had found out, probably from snooping through medical paperwork, and she was planning to argue that Diane was no longer competent to be a Rusty, that I was elderly and should be moved into care, and that as the spouse of my only heir, she had standing to Force a sale. It was a plan built on cruelty, and it would have worked, possibly, on a different man. But I had already called Gerald Pittman, and Gerald Pittman had already called the people who needed to be called. They came back on December 28th. I heard the car pull up. I heard the doors, Cody's voice, the sound of luggage. I was sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee and the newspaper. The front door opened. Stacy walked in first. She looked around the living room with that calculating look she had, the one that was pretending to be casual, but was measuring everything. She seemed surprised to find me still there. "Harold," she said, cool, controlled, almost bored. "Stacy," I said. Just as cool, just as quiet. Cody walked past without looking at me, heading for the refrigerator. Then Daniel came through the door. And when he saw me sitting at the table, he couldn't quite meet my eyes. He looked somewhere past my left shoulder. "Dad," he said. "Son," I said. "Come sit down." Something in my voice must have shifted something in the room, because for a moment, a brief, flickering moment, Daniel looked like the little boy I used to drive to school. Uncertain, searching my face for what was coming. "We need to talk," he said. "We do." I agreed. Stacy crossed her arms. "Harold, I think it's pretty clear what needs to happen." The note said everything. "Yes," I said. The note did say a great deal. "So," she said, "have you made arrangements?" I looked at her. "Quiet still, I have," I said. She looked satisfied. She glanced at Daniel with that look, the look that said, "See, I told you he'd fold." "The arrangements," I said, "are not what you think they are, Stacy." I reached into my shirt pocket, and I laid 3 things on the kitchen table. The first thing was the note, her note. The second thing was a document, a copy of the living trust, with the legal language highlighted that made clear the property could not be transferred, sold, or leveraged without my signed consent. The third thing was a letter, from Gerald Pittman, addressed formally, bearing his firm's letterhead, outlining in careful legal language that any attempt to claim rights to this property through spousal inheritance without the owner's consent would be immediately challenged, and that evidence of a premeditated scheme to defraud an elderly homeowner and his wife, a wife with a documented medical condition, had already been submitted to the state attorney general's office as a preliminary filing. I had not filed charges. I had only filed a preliminary notice, a warning shot, but it was enough. Stacy went pale. I mean that literally. I watched the color drain from her face the way water drains from a sink. "Where did you?" she started. "Gerald Pittman has been my attorney for 19 years. I said, "He's very good at his job." Daniel was looking at the documents, then looking at Stacy, then back at the documents. "Stacy," he said slowly, "what is this?" "Daniel," she started. "What is this, Stacy?" She turned to him, and I watched her make the calculation, the lightning, fast moral arithmetic that people like Stacy make when they are cornered, and I watched her decide to pivot. "Your father is trying to—" "Don't," I said, just one word, and something in how I said it stopped her completely. "Don't do that," I said. "Don't turn this around, not right now, not in this house." I stood up from the table. I am not a tall man. I am not a dramatic man, but I have been working with my hands and my will for 47 years, and when I stand up with intention, people feel it. "Daniel," I said, "I am going to tell you some things now, and I need you to listen to me the way you used to listen to me when you were a boy." Before I paused. Before all of this, he sat down. He looked young and confused and ashamed all at once. "I know about the appraiser," I said. "I know about the buyer's agent. I know about the title search. I know about the real estate attorney your wife contacted in October. I let that settle. I know everything, son. I've known for months." Daniel turned to Stacy, and she had nothing. She had nothing because there was nothing to say. "Your mother," I said, and here my voice did something I didn't fully control. It dropped in a way that brought Daniel's eyes to mine immediately. Your mother has been diagnosed with early-stage Alzheimer's. The room went absolutely silent. She was diagnosed 8 months ago. I have been managing her care quietly at home, because this is her home and she is happy here, and being home with me is the best thing for her. I did not tell you because I was protecting her. I was protecting her from being used as a mechanism in someone else's plan. Daniel's eyes filled with tears. Dad, I'm not finished, I said, gently but firmly. I sold a portion of the business 3 years ago. I have resources. I have a plan for my retirement, for your mother's care, for everything. I am not a desperate old man, Daniel. I am your father. And I have been taking care of this family quietly, without asking for thanks, my entire life. I reached into my jacket pocket. I was wearing my good jacket, the one I'd put on that morning, deliberately, and I took out one more piece of paper. This one was handwritten, not by me, 3 days before the diagnosis. I said, your mother had a very clear day, a very good day, and she knew she had been feeling the fog coming, and so she sat down at the kitchen table and she wrote something. She asked me to keep it. She said, give this to Daniel when it matters most. I held the paper out to my son. He took it with hands that were not entirely steady. He read it. And Daniel, my grown son, my 6-foot, one son who played 3 years of college baseball and could fix an engine and once carried me off a job site. When I twisted my ankle, my son put his face in his hands and he wept. I will not read you what Diane wrote. Some things belong only to the people they were written for. But I will tell you this. Diane had written about the morning Daniel was born. She had written about the way I looked when I first held him. She had written about the 37 years she had watched me love our son, silently, steadily, without condition. She had written in her careful cursive, your father never asked you for anything. That is not because he doesn't need. It is because he loves you more than his own needs. Don't forget that. When I am gone, don't forget that. Stacy was standing at the kitchen counter with her arms at her sides. All the calculation was gone from her face. What was left looked something like shame. Cody, 12 years old, standing in the doorway, looked at his mother and then at Daniel and then at me. And for the first time since I had known him, he looked like a child who genuinely did not know what was happening around him, which, of course, he didn't. Children rarely understand what adults put them in the middle of. I want to be honest with you about something. I could have filed charges. Gerald said we had a reasonable case, not a slam dunk, but reasonable. I could have forced Daniel and Stacy out that day. I had every legal right. I could have called Earl, who was, in fact, in his car 2 blocks away, waiting for my call, because I had asked him to be there, and I could have made things very difficult for Stacy. I didn't, not because I was weak, because I looked at my son's face. And beneath all the bad decisions and the closed mouth and the years of letting Stacy lead him somewhere he should not have gone, beneath all of that, was my boy, my Daniel, the one I drove to school every morning, the one I stayed up with when he had nightmares, the one who cried when I handed him that check at his wedding. He wasn't a villain. He was a man who had made cowardly choices. And cowardice can be corrected. It's harder to correct than cruelty, sometimes, because the coward doesn't always see himself clearly. But it can be done. Here is what is going to happen, I said, sitting back down at the table, calm, clear. Stacy, I need you to understand something. This house is protected. It was protected before you moved in, and it will be protected long after this conversation. There is nothing to pursue here. I am not a target. I am a man in my own kitchen. She nodded. Just once. Small. Daniel, your mother needs consistent care. I have been providing it. I intend to keep providing it. I do not need money to do this. I do not need your help to do this. but I am asking for something I should never have to ask for. Daniel looked at me. Respect, I said. Just basic, human respect for this house, for your mother, and for me. The room was very quiet. Then Daniel said, and I will carry this with me until I die. Daniel said, Dad, I am so sorry. Not to Stacy's script. Not with calculation. Just those 5 words, and they were enough. They were enough to start with. Stacy and Daniel moved out in February. Not because I forced them. Because, I think, Stacy knew the game was over, and Daniel needed space to become himself again without the weight of what had almost happened pressing down on every room. They found an apartment 20 minutes away. It is not a reconciliation story in the way movies tell reconciliation stories. Daniel calls me every Sunday now. We talk for 20-30 minutes. About his week, about his mother. About the old days, sometimes the baseball games, the homework, the mornings in the truck. Stacy has not called me. That is fine. I did not ask for her to. Cody came by once, in March, with Daniel. He helped me carry some boxes to the garage. And when we were done, he said, unprompted, Mr. Harold, I'm sorry about before. I wasn't real respectful. I looked at that 12-year-old boy. Thank you, Cody, I said. That means a great deal. And I meant it. Diane had a harder spring. Some weeks she knew me, and some weeks she didn't. But she is still in her home. She is still in her kitchen. She still walks to the window in the morning and looks at the garden. And on the good days, on the days when she looks at me, and I am Harold to her, and not a kind stranger, on those days I hold her hand and we listen to Johnny Cash, and I think to myself, this is what I protected. This was always what I was protecting. Not property, not money, not pride. This woman, this life, this love. Final section. Slow, deliberate, deeply sincere. I have been thinking about why I wanted to tell this story, and I think it comes down to this. We live in a world that tells quiet people they are weak, that tells patient people they are naive, that tells those who absorb insults without reacting that they must not have any fight in them. I want to tell you something. The most dangerous person in any room is not the loudest one. It is not the one making threats or demands or scenes. The most powerful presence in any room is the one who already knows the truth and is simply waiting for the right moment. I knew, I planned, I was prepared, and I did it all without raising my voice once. There is a particular cruelty in taking advantage of someone's love. It is the cruelest kind of theft, not stealing from the pocket, but stealing from the heart, using a father's love for his son as a lever to move what belongs to the father, using a sick woman's condition as ammunition, using the sacred trust of family as a tool. But here is the thing about cruelty. It requires a victim who doesn't see it coming. I saw it coming, and so I did not become a victim. I became a witness. I watched the plan unfold. I watched the note get written and left on my table on Christmas Eve, and I made my call. And I waited. To Daniel I want to say, you are still my son. You always will be. But being someone's son comes with a weight. It comes with a responsibility to protect the people who gave their lives to protect you. You forgot that for a while. I believe you have remembered it again, and that is enough for me to work with. To Stacy, I want to say nothing more than this. The measure of a person is not what they take. It is what they build. I hope she builds something real someday. And to everyone watching, check on your parents. Call your father. Visit your mother. Do not let the busyness of your life become a wall between you and the people who stayed up late worrying about you, who worked double shifts for you, who cried tears of joy when you were born, and have been loving you every day since, without asking for a single thing in return. Don't wait for a Christmas Eve note to realize what you have, because some silences, the kind that settle into a quiet house after everyone has left, those silences cannot be unsaid. And some apologies, even the ones that are given from the heart, arrive just a little too late. Be good to the ones who love you quietly. That is all.